Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we know we have this problem of scarcity. We have limited resources and unlimited wants and needs. And what we're trying to do is make overall individuals and entire societies better off, more wealthy, more healthy, more satisfied with their life. And of course, when we're dealing with scarcity, we need to have some kind of way to measure whether scarcity is being successfully dealt with or not. Remember, you're never going to get rid of it, but we got to learn how to deal with it. So, how do we know that we're successfully dealing with it? Well, there's some measurements that we can use. All right. Number one is gross domestic product, otherwise known as GDP. This is the market value of all goods and services produced in a country within a year. Formula is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. What is that? That's consumer spending, investments, government spending, and net exports. Consumer spending, of course, is consumers buying goods and services. It represents two-thirds of all GDP, and it's why that economists stress the need for consumption so much, is because that's how money gets moving in the economy. People buy things, it becomes income of somebody else who then goes and buys things, and then the circle, as we shall look at, keeps going round and round. Investments are large purchases by businesses. These are also known sometimes as capital investments. That shows that businesses are expanding and doing well with whatever they're doing. Government spending is not the transfer of payments from government to the people, like welfare checks or Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. This is government buying things like clothing for soldiers, or desks for offices, or pencils, or aircraft carriers, or jets, or anything like that. And finally, net exports. This is exports minus imports. This is exports being goods we send out to other countries. Imports is stuff we bring in from other countries. And then what this does is it measures the overall economic growth and health of a country. And this is usually, GDP is usually the accepted measurement of how well economically a country is doing. The problem is it doesn't actually address the whole story. It doesn't really tell how wealthy the citizens are. Are they well off? Do they have a good standard of living? Are the citizens healthy? Are they dying a lot from disease, violence, those kinds of things? Are citizens actually safe? Do they feel intimidated, coerced, threatened for having certain beliefs? And most of all, are citizens actually happy? Fine, you have a high economic growth, but are your citizens happy? Or are you under a repressive regime? Or what's going on? So then we have to look at other measurements. Number one on that list is going to be GDP per capita. This is the gross domestic product, total value of all goods and services, divided by the population. What this does is gives us a better window into the wealth of the citizen on average. So instead of measuring the economy in the aggregate, in the total, this takes the average citizen, says, okay, well, if you divide all that wealth up, then on average, citizens of a country are going to be about X wealthy. Now, why do we use this a lot? GDP per capita seems to correlate with better standards of living. People eat better, have more calories in places with high GDP per capita. People live longer in places with higher GDP per capita. People seem to go to school longer, are more educated in countries that have a higher GDP per capita. People are happier, so self-reported life satisfaction. They seem to be happier in places that have higher GDP per capita, as opposed to a place like Afghanistan down here in the lower left corner. And then all the bad things seem to get better in terms of solving problems in countries with higher GDP per capita. Children, way less likely to die in places with higher GDP per capita. So, what do these statistics actually look like of all our AP6 countries? Remember, you don't need to know the United States. This is more of a comparative thing. You don't need to know every single number here, but what's important to know is the rank of both GDP and GDP per capita, and if they're growing or not. So in this case, the United States, remember, this is going to be our like comparison to who we are as a country, not on the test. But then China's the largest economic uh, benefactor of the AP6, has the largest GDP overall. And then the UK, Russia, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria having the lowest GDP overall. But when you look at GDP per capita, what do you start noticing? Well, the United States is very high in terms of GDP per capita, but then the United Kingdom right here is second. And then Mexico and Russia, then China. So China is actually, sure, China is an economic powerhouse. They have enormous amounts of output of goods and services and economic growth, but for some reason that's not really translating to down to the average citizen. Citizens are not wealthy. Sure, they're an economically strong country, but their citizens are not wealthy. So something is going on there. And of course, Nigeria here at the bottom is both an economically weak country in terms of growth and also a very poor country in terms of its average overall citizens. So the ranking is more important than anything else. Now, if we want to even break this down farther, we start looking at the overall standard of living of people through what is called the Human Development Index, or HDI. This takes GDP per capita, how wealthy a citizen is, life expectancy, how healthy a citizen is, and mean years of schooling, how educated a citizen is, put them together into a formula, and then we start getting an even better look at how well off a country is doing. So here are the scores. 0 to 0.55 is low, 0.55 to 0.69, mediumly developed countries, 0.7 to 0.8 high, and then anything above 0.8 is considered a pretty highly developed country. And when we look at around the world, we notice that North America, Western Europe, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand are considered very high human development countries. Russia, Kazakhstan, Eastern Europe, less so. Also, then South America, China, and then you get into Central Africa. It's not very well off at all in terms of human development. What do we got in terms of our countries and the capitals? Here's our HDI. The very developed countries, the United States and United Kingdom. Russia is the next tier down and getting worse because of the war. Notice China, Mexico, and Iran are not a whole lot different in terms of overall human development. If you're poor in China, you are really, really poorly off. And of course, Nigeria, very low development overall. I've put the capitals on here so you kind of get an idea. Like when you get an image of a country, often you see its major cities and capitals, and it's not necessarily representative of how well off the country is. So London is pretty well off. It's one of the most well off cities in the world, and so is the UK. Washington, D.C., very well off. The United States, pretty well off as well. But look at here in Russia. If you live in Russia, it's on the low end of some higher development. But if you live in Moscow, you're doing really, really well. You're like you're living in Washington, D.C. Your health, your wealth, your happiness, your satisfaction, much higher in the capital city. All right, that should tell you something about where most of the help, the benefit of government goes. China, if you live in Beijing, you're much better off than the average Chinese person. If you're in Mexico City, you are better off than the average Mexican. If you are in Tehran, in the capital city, then you're a little bit better off than the average Iranian. But look here with Lagos. Lagos is a medium developed city, while the rest of Nigeria is very, very, very poor and impoverished. This is this should tell you something about the corruption and the kleptocracy that exists within Nigeria. And so we can even go into countries and break down independent states if we wanted to. We don't need to for purposes of comparative politics. But notice, places like Massachusetts and New Hampshire have the highest HDI, very high. California has a very high HDI, but a place like Mississippi is in the lower end of the high development. American Samoa, which is the lowest HDI territory, even lower than that. When people tell you places like New York and California are roving hellscapes, horrible places, well, they're healthy, they're wealthy, and they're well educated. That's pretty good. When you get into Appalachia and the South, it's a lot less. And so these are the places that actually need the overall work in terms of government support and help. And notice over time, HDI consistently rising, especially when you get here in China. The next one we look at is the Gini coefficient, Gini index. This measures economic income inequality. Perfect equality is 0. Perfect inequality is 1. And here are the coefficients. The United States does have some inequality issues. Mexico is worse. The UK has a welfare state, so people think it's much more equal. It's not really that much more equal because there's issues of class that still happen depending on where you are. If you're in South of England, you're doing really well. If you live anywhere else, you're not doing nearly as well. China, Russia, Nigeria, and Iran are all much more equal, but they're also equally more poor. So it doesn't mean just because you have this coefficient does not mean that equality means everybody is doing well. It could be that everybody's not doing well at all. So once we have all these things together, we start to look at our failed countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, and developed countries. A failed country is extremely poor, government barely exists. Most people live on sustenance farming, meaning what they can make, they eat. You don't really have an economic system in existence, places like Afghanistan, Haiti, Somalia, and South Sudan. Underdeveloped countries are very poor, governments unstable, people live in rural areas and depend on agriculture, places like Rwanda, Senegal, Bangladesh. Developing countries have a growing middle class, the government is much more stable, people move towards cities to work in factories, places like Indonesia, India, Brazil, and Turkey. And of course, developed countries have a strong upper middle class, government's usually fundamentally stable, people live in cities and suburbs, and mostly they are service oriented, places like the US, Germany, Japan, Australia, South Korea, that kind of thing. For the AP6, here's our list. We have no failed countries in the AP6. Nigeria is clearly underdeveloped, especially the farther away you get from Lagos. It's really, really poor off. Developing countries include China, Russia, Mexico, Iran. Iran being the lower end of that, Russia, China being the upper end of that. And then the United Kingdom is fully entrenched as a developed country.